Reuniting families are overrunning the country with immigrants. We take a look at the family-sponsored visa program President Trump vows to end, as well as an update on a refugee resettlement investigation here. Neighbors fear for their safety after a gun range pops up in North County. And the strange smuggling case involving exotic animals. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, reporter Kate Morrissey of the San Diego Union-Tribune, Taryn Mento, Speak City Heights reporter for KPBS News, reporter Christina Davis of the Union-Tribune, and investigative producer J.W. August of NBC7 San Diego. Well, political labels matter. Compare, for instance, the phrase family reunification with chain migration. Donald Trump uses the latter term. Here's Trump claiming the family reunification program has gone haywire.
Under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children.
All right, Kate, is what Trump is claiming there actually true? How does this program work?
Well, I would say it's misleading at best. The biggest factor in terms of whether or not you could bring in an unlimited number of people is time. It takes quite a bit of time to sponsor someone's green card, for them to wait in line to get the green card, and then if they wanted to in turn sponsor someone to sort of complete this quote-unquote chain that Trump claims happens, they would have to, in most cases, become a U.S. citizen, which takes another 5 years of waiting, and then you have to sponsor someone, and then they're waiting in line. So the time element is missing from that statement. And then the other part that doesn't entirely ring true is the idea of distant relatives, and that depends, in some cases, I guess, what you consider to be distant. But you can't sponsor your grandmother, you can't sponsor aunts and uncles, you can't sponsor cousins or nieces or nephews.
Third cousin twice removed?
No, none of those. You can sponsor, if you're a U.S. citizen, you can sponsor your spouse or minor children fairly quickly. The longer lines have different breakdowns. So if you're a U.S. citizen, you can sponsor adult children. Now there's different lines depending on whether those children are married or not. And then you can also sponsor your brothers or sisters. If you're a green card holder, you're limited to your spouse and minor children.
Now, how is Trump proposing to change the family reunification system?
So he's proposing to limit it to spouse and minor children only.
Okay, and that's a pretty basic change, just restrict it right down to that. How much support does he have in Congress? He'd have to have 60 senators sign on, right?
Right, well, based on the votes that happened on some of the legislation that was looking to provide a permanent solution for DACA recipients, it doesn't look like it has a lot of support. The bill that included that got very few votes.
Okay, now give us an idea of the scope here. How many family-sponsored visas are issued annually, and who gets them?
Well, it's a little bit of a complicated question, because if you're bringing in who are considered the most immediate relatives, so that would be if you're a U.S. citizen, your spouse, your minor children, and your parents, there's not a cap on the number of those that can come in a year. And so that fluctuates year to year. Last fiscal year, there were about 250,000 that came in. And then there's the family preference program, which is those lines I was talking about, where each relationship sort of has its own line, and there's an annual cap of 226,000 on people coming in through that part of the program.
Okay, and what are those favoring more restrictions on immigration, those who support Trump in this? What do they have to say?
So they say that having a familial relationship isn't a good enough reason to give somebody a green card in this country. They would rather see a merit-based program where people are being chosen based on specific work credentials or skills. And their argument is that, someone's family member might not necessarily have those skills.
Mm-hmm. Taryn?
Do we know how much it would affect the San Diego region if these restrictions did go into effect?
It's hard to say numbers-wise, because the data is all at the national level that I've been able to get from the State Department. But given just the largeness of the immigrant community here in San Diego, I would imagine that many of them have family members they're hoping to sponsor. I've interviewed people who live here who either have come on that program or are waiting for their green card through that program. So there's definitely a number of people here, but I couldn't speak to exact.
Well, that begs my next question. You've interviewed some folks who've benefited from this program in San Diego. What's their reaction to Trump's proposed changes?
So the reaction was very much that they were grateful that they'd gotten their green cards before all of this happened, and mostly expressions of sadness for people who might still be waiting or might not later be able to sponsor relatives. The people who I interviewed were both still in the process of waiting for their citizenship, and they had relatives in mind. One man wanted to bring his parents after he became a citizen, and then one woman wanted to bring her 2 adult daughters.
Okay. J.W.?
And the parents and these relatives are vetted like anybody else. I mean, you don't get a free ride into the country without any vetting.
No, there's definitely security checks involved, and both the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security are involved in the visa process before you actually get a green card.
Now, given, of course, we had President Trump on the State of the Union at the outset, and that bite he talked about, and as you said, a lot of observers have said it was a misleading characterization of this. There was an interesting story in the Washington Post this week. Turns out Trump's mother and father-in-law, his wife's parents, of course, got legal status through chain migration, as he calls it, from their native country in Eastern Europe. Have we heard any comment from the president about that?
You know, I was looking, scouring the internet this morning to see if he had said anything, and I didn't see anything on it. But if any of you,
check his Twitter feed?
I did check his Twitter feed. It was a different series of things he seemed to be concerned with in the last day or two. But if any of you saw anything, I'd be interested to know.
Maybe it's 3 a.m. this morning. You may be
Wait for the weekend early morning tweets. There might be something on that. All right. Well, that's fascinating, and we'll keep seeing what happens with DACA and immigration, and it's not going to go away with this administration, that's for sure. Well, on to another story regarding immigrants. Anyone trying to find a place to rent in San Diego knows what a tough market it is. Imagine trying to find housing for immigrants facing severe language and cultural barriers. That's the challenge for the International Rescue Committee, a nonprofit that's facing violations for overcrowding. And Taryn, this problem surfaced nearly 2 years ago. What was the story at that time?
Right. So previously we reported that, in late 2016, IRC was putting some large families into smaller apartments. And to do that at the time, they were leaving a couple of names off of leases in order to get around this idea of this issue of occupancy limits. But that became a problem because when landlords were made aware, they actually asked some of the families to leave, issued them notices to vacate due to overcrowding. And what's new in our story this week is we learned that before all of this happened, officials with the State Department actually paid a visit to the IRC to kind of a routine review and found that there were a couple of instances where they were not adhering to occupancy limits and asked them to correct it.
Okay. And give us an idea of the scope of this. How many families have to be resituated out of the total number of refugees who've come into San Diego?
So when we talked to 7 families, and out of them, 4 of them actually they were asked to leave their homes and had to find new homes. But when we spoke to the IRC, because they did their own review after our findings, they said that they were able to identify 24 families that this affected out of 2,200, they said that they resettled over the last couple of years. So a small amount, but still 24 people were affected.
And set the scene for us here. Who are some of the refugees involved, and what kind of housing situations are we talking about? And you're focusing on the mid-city, the City Heights area.
Well, and City Heights and El Cajon, the Syrian refugees, we saw a lot of them coming in at the end of 2016. And a lot of them were coming over as larger families, 7 to 8 people. But that size family needs a 3-bedroom for occupancy limits at the local and federal level. But that's a lot of money, and they don't get a lot of money to resettle them. So they looked to 2-bedroom apartments, which house 5 or 6 people, and found that if they put 5 or 6 names on the lease and put 7 or 8 people into those homes, they could actually afford it.
JW?
How are they the ones you did? I remember in the story you reported some people did move into larger places. Where were they getting the money from? I mean, are there groups out there helping them?
There are 2 of the out of the 4 that we spoke with. 1 family moved to Michigan because it was far more affordable. And 2 other families did get homes with the assistance of community members. I think that one had a church that was fundraising to help them meet the monthly rent. That was because the bigger house was more expensive. And there's a nonprofit out there that is providing rental assistance to specifically Syrian refugees.
Are there any penalties that this agency might be facing, or because it sounds like they knew what they were doing was not on the up and up?
It doesn't seem, well, I mean, the only thing that I think the cooperative agreement says is that, if you violate the terms of this agreement, and one of those is providing safe, stable housing, you may not be a part of this program the following year. IRC is so big and serves so many refugees across the nation that I don't think that this practice occurring here would result in them not getting to be a part of the program the following year. So that hasn't happened, but they were asked by the State Department to launch that internal investigation and make some swift changes. And they did. They made some significant changes very quickly.
And in addition to those changes, they have a new director, right?
Right. After the reporting, the director stepped down, and they now have a new interim director who actually came from Dallas. But a couple of changes included that they now look at the size of families that they resettle here. Unless you have a family tie here, they're trying to send families that are larger than 6 people to more affordable areas. I think maybe the Arizona area is one of them. And they also, recently we learned that they now require, at all of their affiliates across the country, not just San Diego, that workers provide copies of leases proving that they accounted for everybody, and they keep those in their case files.
Now, you did get a bit of pushback on this story, social media and elsewhere. People are saying, why go after the IRC? It's an organization that does a lot of good, as you say.
Right. Well, first of all, your tax dollars go to support organizations like the IRC, resettlement organizations. Your tax dollars are what are used to pay for the first 3 months of rent for refugees. So as journalists, we make sure that those systems are working well. And we found in this instance it wasn't. And we, asked questions about it, and they made changes that hopefully will benefit refugees in the future, because refugees focused on self-sufficiency, and if you're facing housing instability, it's going to be difficult to be able to find a job and be able to support yourself in the future.
Kate, I was going to say we have about a minute left in this segment. I did want to ask about your story this week, which noted far fewer refugees coming to San Diego following Trump's ban on those from certain countries. What are the numbers showing? It's dramatic, isn't it?
It is dramatic. So when you look at the first 4 months of the last fiscal year, when we were still under the caps set by the Obama administration, and you compare that to the first 4 months of this fiscal year, so through the end of January, you see a 96% drop when you look at the data from the State Department. So that's, in real numbers, that's going from 1,100 to 40.
Wow. That's dramatic, as we say.
I think it's also important to note that most of the refugees that we resettled in the county last fiscal year happened in those first 4 months. So this drop is not necessarily new, but because we took in so many in those first 4 months, it could have a big difference in terms of what our overall numbers look like at the end.
Okay. All right. Well, as I say, immigration is going to continue to be a huge front burner issue, especially in this election year. Well, we're going to move on. Many folks reach a certain age and stage and move out to the San Diego backcountry to enjoy peace and quiet. The last thing they expect is a firing range to open next door. But that's the case for a development not far from the Safari Park in North County. And it's not just the constant noise from high-powered guns that has neighbors upset. JW, set the scene to begin with. Where is this private shooting range we're talking about?
It's just north of a housing development, San Pasqual Community Housing Development. It is in a small valley, and it was listed by the county as a vacant lot, unimproved vacant lot.
And as we should say, and we've talked many times in the show about wildfires, this is the famous urban wildland interface where red flag fire stuff happens all the time.
This place is right in the middle of it. To the north was the Lilac Fire. The Witch Creek Fire was nearby. It's within 25 miles, 30 miles of all these major firestorms
that have gone through here in the last decade or more.
Okay. There's actually been a fire on the property in the past.
And we'll get to more of that. So when did this range open up?
According to I can't say specifically, but it looks like about 2016.
Okay. And what did you find out about the people who bought this land?
Well, it was interesting finding out who owned the land because it's listed as a vacant lot. It did not have an address attached to it. So we had to use Google Maps, and we knew the exact location. And through that, the assessor came up with the name. It was called the Freedom Fighters Foundation, under 501c3 nonprofit.
Okay. And so the Freedom Fighter Foundation, and they claim, what is their purpose they claim as a mission as this
Second
organization?
Amendment, they support the Second Amendment, and they call people to arms against oppressive governments.
Okay, and they had some videos on a website, right?
Yeah.
Which, but once you started doing the story, are these accessible anymore, these videos?
Oh, they disappeared after we started making inquiries to them. But the videos are like mind-blowing because it looks like something out of a movie.
Okay, so some of them, the militia movement that was very rampant in the country 20 years ago, let's say, this was reminiscent of that, some of these videos.
I'm not mentioning militia in this story at all.
All right, very good. I guess if they were
But
still
if you
accessible.
saw the video,
I did
yes,
see the video, and I don't know if they're
they're
accessible
shooting
anymore.
up everything.
Christina?
Can the general public pay and go shoot guns at this range, or do you
No,
kind of have to be part of this group?
You have to be. It's a private range by invite only, and they invite law enforcement to come too. So their attorney that represents them said that they do invite different elements of law enforcement to practice and take part of this private firing range.
Karen?
They invite them, but do they go? Does other law enforcement?
It's hard to tell. I can't tell you who attends the thing, who's there. I just know some of the agencies that go to the place.
Because it's private.
And so we know what they stand for, but do they do rallies? Do they do events? I mean, what activities other than
fundraising? Okay. That's all I could see. I looked at their 501c3 docs and looked at how much they've been raising, and they don't really say the source of the revenues, but like last year was 50 grand. And I don't know if that 50 grand actually comes from people paying to use the range, because they say it's free to their friends in law enforcement.
Well, tell us about some of the neighbors' complaints now. It seems noise is only a...
The fire is the big issue because fire can, guns can create sparks can create fires, et cetera, et cetera. They're also worried about stray bullets, that the foothills around there are used by the people to walk through. This is a residential area, and they like to go hiking, and the trails go right by the place. And the noise.
Worried about people wandering on.
And I was there when I first heard the tip. I actually didn't believe something like this would be going on for a couple of years and nobody say anything. And I stood in the neighborhood and listened on a Sunday, and it sounded like it was in a war zone.
All right, well, that sets up a bite we have. This is neighbor John Carroll, retired FBI SWAT team agent whom you interviewed, and then we're going to follow that by a bit of what the range sounds like.
When that bullet hits a steel target out there, or when that bullet hits a rock, it's going to split and shatter. Or the fire danger just from that one bullet alone is extreme.
All right, so JW, what were neighbors told about who's running the range?
They couldn't find out because it was a vacant lot according to the county. When they try to find the permit or the address, there's no address because it's a vacant lot. And the only way we found it, like I said, is through Google Maps, and we were able to pinpoint exactly where it was.
And those operating a range, what did they say when you approached them with the questions about the neighbors' complaints?
Not much. One of the gentlemen, appears to be the lead guy on this, refused to talk to me. The only thing he said, he didn't trust the media, and goodbye.
Okay, and is there a permit required to open a range such as this?
Good question. I do not know. I think the county's wrestling with right now. They're one of the several, the county and a couple other federal agencies are looking into this, and they are not. The attorney representing the Freedom Fighters Foundation says no permit is required.
But you had a follow-up story. It noted there was another range not far away, and it was several years ago.
The first story led to some, as you know, when you do a story like this, you get other leads. And this lead came in that there had been a prior firing range in almost the same location that got a cease and desist order from the sheriff's department.
About 5 years ago?
Yeah, exactly. And the names on it, one of the names on it is the Border Patrol agent who we ran into the current firing range. So he was listed on the cease and desist order from a number of years ago.
All right. Last question. Just almost out of time on this segment. But once your first story ran, Congressman Scott Peters responded. What did he do?
He's asking the Border Patrol, what's going on? You got your guys running a private firing range, and you're training there, and what the heck's going on?
So we'll see if there's any result of that and maybe a follow-up story.
And the ATF is looking, and not officially.
Okay. All right. We'll look for a follow-up on that. Fascinating stuff. Well, we're going to move on. When we think of cross-border smuggling, drugs and people, maybe weapons going south come to mind. But the illegal trade sometimes extends to exotic animals as well. So, Christina, tell us what agents found in the floorboards of a Chevy Camaro one day last summer.
They found a cute little baby tiger, 6 weeks old, just kind of nestled between someone's legs and sitting in the passenger seat.
So, and these tigers are endangered animals. What did the smuggler claim when he got caught? How did he come upon this animal?
Well, it was the driver and the passenger, and they kind of said at first, oh, it's just a cat. And then the CBP officer took a closer look and realized that it's obviously a tiger. You can tell just by looking at it. And
where did they get it, supposedly?
Well, the driver basically tells a story that he's an 18-year-old kid. He's down in TJ, and he happens to see a guy walking a bigger, full-grown tiger on a leash just down the street one day, which, you know, those kinds of things
see it all the time when
happen.
I'm too on it.
And so he claims he saw that, and he started talking to the guy, and he got it into his head that he wanted a tiger for a pet for himself. So he says he paid like $300, and a few days later got this tiger cub, came in via airplane, went into the airport down in TJ and picked it up and was bringing it across.
But the prosecutors had a different tale when they investigated this whole thing. What did the prosecutors, how did they portray this narrative when it got to court?
That's right. I mean, from the get-go, the prosecutors really suspected him of being involved in more kind of illicit activity.
More sophisticated smuggling.
Although we didn't really know much. In court papers that we just got last week, it really kind of spelled out the whole thing. And they went through this kid's cell phone, and they found what they said was a lot of evidence that points to him being involved in a whole cross-border exotic wildlife smuggling scheme. Text messages back and forth with people talking about, he can get this animal and this animal for this price, and his source in Mexico can get them all. And a lot of pictures of different kinds of wildlife on his phone.
And a plan to get the converted Camaro to the border so they could use it.
And there's pictures of what the prosecutors say looks like a hidden compartment in a car, and text messages talking about will the tiger cub fit in the compartment to cross the border? Can we give him some anesthesia so he won't make any noise when he's crossing, and that kind of stuff.
Is there any question that maybe he was boasting a bit in these text messages about other smuggling operations, or have they been able to, or are they looking into where did these other animals possibly go, and have they been able to find out if he was actually involved in those and the other ones he was talking about?
So the way that this case worked in court is he ended up pleading guilty, because a lot of that stuff would come out in trial, I would think, if they were to take this case to trial. He ended up pleading guilty pretty early on. And the case kind of stops there at that point. And the prosecution still wanted to bring a lot of this kind of evidence forward for the sentencing purposes. That being said, I'm sure they're still investigating this, alleged network and who his sources are. They've got text messages, right?
And didn't he say at one point that he sold one to his brother?
Yeah, he said that. They have a huge string of text messages between him and this guy who sells foxes in the LA area, which I haven't checked if having a fox is legal or not. I don't know.
Yeah, JW.
What other critters was he offering? What other animals was he offering up for sale across?
He's talking about monkeys. Jaguars. I think he said something like, "Oh yeah, I can get jaguars for $8,000, lions for $5,000, different kinds of tigers,
foxes."
And then he was talking about to this fox vendor in the LA area.
Where do they find these? If you know, where do they find these animals to smuggle?
In this case, I think they're coming from Mexico, and I don't think they're necessarily capturing them out in the wild. I think there's a huge captive breeding programs all over the world, really. But
and who's buying them on this side of the border?
Your neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, is that?
I'll start peeking over the back fence here and say,
seriously. I mean, so the U.S. is the second largest market when it comes to people wanting to buy exotic wildlife for pets or for collections. China's the biggest market. And there's a huge problem with people really thinking that they can have a tiger cub or even full-grown tigers in their backyard, and that they can they can host these animals and care for them properly, and very poisonous snakes and all kinds of things.
All right, a couple of questions before we have to say goodbye. How did this prosecution turn out of this fellow Valencia?
So, like I said, he pleaded guilty to one charge, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. And
the tigers, what happened to them?
So the tigers have a very happy ending. They ended up, right when they were seized at the border, they went to the San Diego Safari Zoo Park, right next to the firing range.
Gun range, you all work together.
And it just so happened that when that tiger cub went there was another tiger cub that had been born right around the same time in Washington, D.C.
So he's got a pal then.
Oh, and that cub was orphaned, and they brought him here.
That is a happy ending. All right, we're out of time. That's a great ending of that one. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Kate Morrissey of the San Diego Union-Tribune, Taryn Mento of KPBS News, Christina Davis of the Union-Tribune, and J.W. August of NBC7 San Diego. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.